The week before my grandmother passed, she pressed a folded envelope into my hand and told me not to open it until I had something worth protecting. I was 19 years old, sitting in a hospice room that smelled like lavender and antiseptic, and I thought she was being dramatic in the way that people sometimes get when they know time is running out. I kissed her hand and slipped the envelope into the back pocket of my jeans. She made me promise. I promised. I did not open it for 6 years. My grandmother's name was Frances, and she was the only person in my family who ever asked me about my work, the way you ask someone about work that matters. Not politely, not to fill silence. She genuinely wanted to know about the clay bodies and the firing schedules and why one glaze behaved differently at cone 6 than cone 10. She kept a small ceramic mug I made at 16 on her kitchen windowsill, the one with the lopsided handle and the drip of blue down the side that I considered a failure. She called it her favorite thing she owned. My father built Callaway Restoration and Design from nothing, which is the version of the story he told at every dinner party, every contractor event, every charity auction we attended growing up in Scottsdale, Arizona. He started in his mid-20s with a pickup truck and a crew of 3, rehabbing distressed properties across the valley. By the time I was in high school, Callaway R&D was the firm that wealthy homeowners called when they wanted the original details preserved, when they cared about the history of a space as much as the outcome. He had 40 employees. He had a reputation that took 20 years to build. He was, and still is, genuinely extraordinary at what he does. He also ran his family the way he ran his job sites, with a clear hierarchy, clear expectations, clear consequences for deviation. My older brother started working summers in the office at 15. By 22, he had his project management certification and spoke my father's language fluently, the language of load-bearing walls and ROI and client acquisition. He was the succession plan, and he wore it comfortably, the way you wear something that was made to fit you. I was a problem from early on. I took a ceramics class sophomore year of high school because it fit my schedule and I needed an art credit. I walked into that room and something clicked into place that I still cannot fully explain. There was a logic to working with clay that felt like speaking a language I had always known but never been taught. The way pressure and moisture and heat produced predictable outcomes if you understood the variables. The way you could push the material exactly as far as it would go and no further. I started staying after school 3 days a week, then 5. I saved babysitting money to buy my own tools. My ceramics teacher, a quiet man who had studied under a master potter in North Carolina, told my parents at junior year conferences that I had genuine technical ability and a sensibility that was hard to teach. My father thanked him and told me on the drive home that art was a beautiful way to spend the weekend. I applied to the ceramics program at Alfred University in New York, the fall of my senior year. Alfred has one of the oldest and most respected ceramics programs in the country. I did not tell my father until after I submitted the application. When I got in, with a partial merit scholarship, I made a presentation. I actually sat down and made a document with projected costs and loan estimates and potential career paths. I was 17 years old and I made a PowerPoint because I thought if I spoke his language, he would hear me. He listened to the whole presentation. Then he told me that he had spent 20 years building something that could absorb 2 people comfortably. That my brother could not run the client side alone. And that I was talented and smart enough to do something real with my life. He told me Alfred was a school for people who had not figured out yet that art did not pay the bills. He told me he was not going to fund 4 years of a degree that would leave me dependent on something as unstable as other people's taste. I told him I would take out loans. He told me that if I chose Alfred over the business, he would consider it a choice I was making about my future, and he would respect it by removing himself from my financial picture entirely. No help with school. No help after school. No help after school. No seat waiting when I eventually came to my senses. I said I understood. He picked up my ceramics portfolio from the kitchen counter, the one I had assembled over 3 years and submitted to Alfred. He flipped through it the way you flip through a magazine in a waiting room. Then he set it down, not roughly, just with a finality that was worse than roughness, and walked out to take a call. I went to my room and sat on the floor for a long time. Then I remembered the envelope in my jewelry box. I had moved it there from the back pocket of those jeans, but I had not opened it. A promise was a promise. I did not have anything worth protecting yet. I put it back. I enrolled at Alfred in September. My father transferred my remaining college fund, which he had controlled as a custodial account, to my brother's education account the week I left. That was the number I learned later, from my aunt who handled some of the family accounting. It was $22,000. He did not tell me directly, he simply did not mention it again. Alfred was hard in the way that good things are hard. I took out federal loans. I worked 20 hours a week at a campus cafe, closing shifts on weekdays and doubles on Sundays. I ate a lot of ramen, not because it was charming or character building, but because it was what I could afford. I was in the studio at 6 most mornings before my shift. My hands were perpetually dry and cracked from clay and dishwater. I was more alive than I had ever been in my life. My second year, a visiting artist came through and saw a series of functional vessels I was developing. She described the work as having a quiet authority. I wrote those 2 words on a piece of tape and stuck it to my studio shelf. Not as ego, as a compass. I graduated in 3.5 years, taking summer sessions to reduce loan interest. I did not invite my father. My mother had passed when I was 11, and my father had remarried when I was 14. My stepmother sent a card that arrived 2 days after the ceremony. My brother texted the morning of. I appreciated that. I had lunch alone at a diner near campus and treated myself to pie and felt genuinely content. I moved to Portland, Oregon, because the craft community there was serious and interconnected, and the cost of living, while not cheap, was survivable if you were disciplined. I rented a studio space in a collective on the east side. I shared the building with a woodworker, a textile artist, and a bookbinder named Alma, who became one of my closest friends. I built slowly, deliberately. I developed a line of functional ceramics, dinnerware and serving pieces and storage vessels that prioritized durability and use over display. I sold at the Portland Saturday Market the first 2 years. My first weekend, I made $87. I came back the next Sunday. I applied for every small business grant I found. I won 2 of them, totaling $9,000, which I used entirely for equipment and materials. I documented everything in composition notebooks, glaze formulas, and firing logs and customer feedback and wholesale pricing calculations. My grandmother would have loved those notebooks. They were the ceramic equivalent of the fermentation logs I had read about, or the hydration ratio research, the obsessive documentation of someone who understood that craft was reproducible science as much as art. By year 3, I had a wholesale account with a kitchen goods boutique in the Pearl District. By year 4, I had 6 wholesale accounts, including one in Brooklyn that moved 40 pieces a month. A food writer, who was working on a piece about table design, asked to use my dinnerware for the photo shoot. The article ran in a magazine that I had seen in my stepmother's reading stack for years. The piece described the work as possessing the calm confidence of something made to outlast its moment. I kept my name quiet. I did not do lifestyle content. I did not build a personal brand around my story. I talked about the clay bodies and the firing process, and why I sourced locally when possible. I gave the workroom to speak. My father knew eventually. Scottsdale and the design world are not as separate as you would think. My stepmother saw the magazine piece. My brother called, which I appreciated, and told me our father had described the operation as a nice little hobby business. I thanked him for calling and went back to trimming a batch of bowls. 3 months ago, on a Tuesday morning that started like every other Tuesday, a man in a well-cut blazer walked into my studio during open hours. He introduced himself as the procurement director for a hospitality group called Varela Collection. Varela operates 11 boutique hotels in the Pacific Northwest and California, the kind of properties that understand that the physical experience of a meal is an extension of the hospitality itself. They had been searching for a ceramic supplier who could produce consistent, beautiful, durable work at volume. Their food and beverage director had visited Portland on a personal trip, had breakfast at a restaurant using my dinnerware, and had tracked the supplier information down from the restaurant manager. He placed a proposal on my workbench. Varela wanted to equip all 11 properties with my dinnerware, a full service for each room, plus communal pieces for the dining spaces. The contract was for 3 years. The value was $1.2 million. He asked if I could scale production to meet the volume. He told me Varela was prepared to support a production expansion if needed. He bought a set of 4 dinner plates on his way out and paid without hesitating at the price. I sat on my stool after he left and looked at my hands for a long time. That evening, I called my attorney, a woman I had worked with since the early grant applications, and asked her to review the terms. She told me to give her a week. I told her I was not going anywhere. My phone rang 2 days later, Arizona area code. I almost did not answer. My father did not begin with hello. He began the way he began every business conversation, with the agenda already established in his own mind. An efficiency that I had spent my whole life trying to read his warmth, and eventually stopped. He told me he had heard about the Varela contract. The design and hospitality networks in the West are smaller than most people realize. He told me he was calling because he had a proposition. Callaway R&D had been contracting out a significant amount of decorative and finish work on their high-end residential projects, custom tile installations, bespoke fixture elements, artisan surface details, the things that wealthy clients in Scottsdale wanted and were increasingly willing to pay for. It was a gap in their service offering. He'd been thinking for some time about integrating a ceramics operation into the company's portfolio. My work, he said, was exactly the caliber that their client base expected. The Varela contract proved the scale was there. His proposition was that my studio would become a subsidiary of Callaway R&D. He would provide business infrastructure, existing client relationships, and the Callaway name, which carried 30 years of reputation in the Arizona luxury market. I would relocate production to a facility he would build out in Scottsdale. In exchange, he would take a 40% stake in the studio going forward, and a 15% royalty on the Varela contract revenue. He said it made sense for the family to function as a unified business entity. He said he had always believed in my talent. He said that what I had built was impressive, and that he wanted to be part of where it was going. I listened to the entire thing without interrupting. I told him I needed a few days to think. This was not a lie, but it was not the full truth either. I knew my answer. What I needed was to make sure the answer came from somewhere solid and not from the 18-year-old who sat on her floor after he set down her portfolio. The next morning, I drove 40 minutes out of Portland to a trailhead I use when I need to think in a place where the scale of things resets. I walked for 2 hours. I thought about the $22,000. I thought about my brother texting on graduation day. I thought about $87 on a Saturday and what I bought with it and what it cost and what it meant. I thought about my attorney's voice on the phone reviewing the Varela terms, the quiet satisfaction in her tone, like she was watching something land exactly where she had hoped it would. I drove back to Portland, called my attorney, and told her to proceed with the Varela contract. Then I called my father. I told him I was declining. I told him I was genuinely glad the business was thriving and that I hoped the decorative work gap found a good solution. I told him I did not have any appetite for a conflict, and that I hoped he knew that. Then I told him what was true. I told him that 6 years ago, he walked away from my portfolio the way you set down something that does not belong to you. I told him I had understood, over time, that he was not trying to be cruel. He was trying to protect me from a version of difficulty that he had experienced himself, starting with nothing, building under pressure, watching things fail. He wanted to spare me that. I understood the impulse. I did not share the destination he had in mind. I told him that the ceramic studio was not a nice little hobby business. It was the work of 6 years of 5 a.m. mornings, and cracked hands and moans and market Sundays, and a $9,000 grant I spent without hesitation because I knew exactly what it was for. It carried the labor of everyone in the collective who had helped me troubleshoot a kiln failure at midnight or watched my booth when I needed a bathroom break. It was not available as a subsidiary. It was not available at 40% or any percent. It had a name. That name was mine. My father was quiet for a long moment. He said that my grandmother always told him I was the one who would be difficult to argue with. I said she knew me pretty well. He asked if we could have a conversation sometime. Not about business, just a conversation. I told him I was open to that. I meant it. I said goodbye. I was not angry. I was something cleaner than that. The Varela contract went into effect 6 weeks later. I hired 2 additional full-time production assistants and expanded into the adjacent studio space in the collective when the woodworker relocated. Alma helped me move equipment over a long weekend and refused to let me pay her. I paid her anyway, in cash and in the set of serving bowls she had been quietly wanting for 2 years. On the day the first shipment went out to the Varela properties, I went home that evening and finally opened my grandmother's envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a key. The note said, "There's a storage unit at Copper Basin Self-Storage in Mesa, Unit 14. The key opens it. I have been filling it slowly since you were 15. It is not money. It is everything I kept that was worth keeping. Your first mug is in there. The lopsided one. That is the one I always loved most." I drove to Mesa the following weekend. The unit was small, a 5x8 climate-controlled. Inside were 24 ceramic pieces I had made from high school through Alfred that she had quietly collected, asking my brother to pick things up when he visited, arranging them on shelves with small handwritten tags noting the date and what she remembered about each one. There was the lopsided mug from the windowsill. She had wrapped it in a dish towel printed with lemons. I sat on the floor of that storage unit for a long time. My grandmother understood something that took me years to understand for myself. Not building something real is not primarily an act of defiance, though sometimes it looks like one from the outside. It is an act of faith in the specific direction of your own instincts, maintained over time, without the confirmation that the direction is correct. Because that confirmation only arrives after the fact. You cannot know in advance that the lopsided handle is worth keeping. You can only decide to keep it. My father built something extraordinary. I spent a long time being angry that his version of love looked like limitation. I spent a little time being sad about it. Now, I mostly understand it and let it be what it was. He called me last month. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing in particular. He asked about the Varela properties and I told him about the clay body I had been developing for the dining room pieces. He was quiet in the way he gets when he is actually listening, which is different from his other kinds of quiet, and at the end he said it sounded like serious work. I told him it was. There's a shelf above my workbench where I keep one piece from every year I have been working. The first piece on the left is the most technically imperfect. I do not hide it or rotate it out. It is the record of where the work started, and without it the rest of the shelf does not mean what it means. My grandmother knew that at 16, watching me pull that lopsided mug off the wheel, she put it on her windowsill and left it there. If you have ever been told that what you make is a hobby, that what you love is not serious enough to be a life, that the path you are choosing is a beautiful waste of potential, I want you to hear this. The people who say those things are not always wrong about the difficulty. They are almost always wrong about you. Keep showing up at 5 in the morning. Keep documenting the failures next to the successes. Build the thing that carries your name. It will outlast every conversation about why you shouldn't have tried. There's a lopsided mug on the shelf above my workbench. The handle tilts slightly to the left. The glaze drips unevenly down one side. I made it when I was 16 years old and I considered it a failure the moment it came off the wheel. My grandmother, Frances, kept it on her kitchen windowsill for the rest of her life. I have thought about that mug a lot over the past few months. Not because it was good work. It wasn't. But because she saw something in it that I couldn't see yet. She understood that the impulse behind the imperfect thing was more important than the imperfection itself. That is the kind of intelligence that doesn't announce itself. It just quietly keeps the mug on the windowsill and lets time do its work. What happened between my father and me did not resolve itself dramatically. There was no single moment of reckoning. What actually happened is that 2 people made choices, steadily, over years. And those choices accumulated into outcomes that neither of us fully controlled. He chose to walk away from my portfolio. I chose to keep going anyway. Those were not equivalent choices in terms of what they cost each of us, but they were both choices, and the results followed logically from them. That is not karma in any mystical sense. It is just the ordinary mechanics of cause and consequence playing out over enough time to become visible. My father is not a villain. He built something real from nothing, and that required a specific kind of discipline that leaves marks. The same drive that made him successful made him unable to imagine success taking a different shape than the one he recognized. I do not hold that against him anymore, but I also do not pretend it didn't cost me something to walk away from $22,000 and a family financial structure at 19 with a single suitcase and loans I spent 3 years paying down. What carried me through was not courage in the romantic sense. It was closer to stubbornness in service of something I genuinely understood. I knew Clay. I knew what I was doing in that studio, and I had enough intellectual honesty to document every failure alongside every success, to treat the work as a system worth understanding rather than a performance worth admiring. That kind of clear-eyed attention to your own process is what separates people who get better from people who stay at the level of their first enthusiasm. And then there is the plain matter of showing up, 5 in the morning, cracked hands, $87 on a Saturday, not because suffering is noble, but because the work required presence, and presence required choosing it over comfort, repeatedly, without guarantee. That accumulation of small, unglamorous choices is what the Varela contract was actually built on, not talent, not luck. Thousands of mornings. Frances knew this. She kept the lopsided mug because she recognized the seriousness behind the imperfection. She funded a storage unit quietly for years because she believed the seriousness would compound. She was right, and she did not need to be alive to see it to make the investment. I think about what it means to really believe in someone before the evidence is there. That is its own kind of integrity, to act in accordance with what you genuinely see in a person, rather than what is convenient or safe to acknowledge. My father had that capacity. He applied it to my brother and to his business. I have had to make peace with not being the recipient of it. That peace is real now, and it was a long time coming. Build the thing you actually understand. Document it honestly. Stay in the room long enough for the work to tell you what it needs. The outcomes will follow from those 3 things more reliably than from anything else I know. The mug is still on the shelf. The handle still tilts left. I would not straighten it if I could.